Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about the second half of my March reads for 2025. Getting straight back into the books, the next book that I read was A Little Trickerie by Rosanna Pike. This is the first book that I've read as part of the Women's Prize longlist. I am pretty surprised that this didn't actually make it onto the shortlist. I think quite a lot of people were. So this is a historical fiction novel set in Tudor England in 1500. We're following the main character of Tib Ingleby, whose mother dies in childbirth, giving birth to a daughter who was fathered by a local farmer who is already married and so will not take the child in. Tib ends up setting fire to the farmer's home and runs away with the child, trying to keep her alive. She ends up running across a young boy called Ivo, who takes her in, and following the death of her baby sister, the two of them end up traversing the English countryside together, looking for somewhere to call home, which is no easy thing as two homeless children. At a point in the novel, they end up being separated, and Tib ends up going along with a troupe of performers, having discovered young that she can contort her body into the smallest of places. And here in this troupe, she is able to find the family that she's never had, all of whom are connected by the fact that they are outcasts to society. Along the way, Tib is learning more about the world and different corruptions within Tudor England, particularly that of religious corruption. And around about 2/3 of the book, Tib comes up with a plot to be able to turn that corruption on its head and get a bit of material gain for herself and her friends. This is one that I ended up listening to on audio, and I definitely recommend it since Tib has such a strong voice and character. I really like how she is written in this book. At times incredibly naive, but then you get these little glimpses of wisdom. Through the years, you definitely get a strong sense of her maturing, of the different pieces of her experiences all coming together into this one whole. I think the best part of this book is the characterization of Tib and her friends. I really enjoyed this very unique take on Tudor England, especially as myself, I am often, I will confess, more drawn to stories that are about the Tudor court. I don't tend to read a whole lot about the everyday person and how these ordinary people are just working to survive. I think the claustrophobic atmosphere of this world was just really well drawn. If there is one thing that I can criticise this book for, it is definitely the pacing. I know a lot of people have talked about the fact that this book can be at times quite slow. I was very surprised to see that the Little Trickerie of A Little Trickery didn't actually crop up until around about 2/3 of the way through the book. It did feel like this plot was quite slow to get going. This being said, I did notice how a lot of the threads that Rosanna Pike weaved into the story did eventually culminate in the climax of the book, and it did feel really satisfying to see how those different breadcrumbs that she dropped earlier on in the story and you might have thought, oh, why is this necessary, did end up coming to be significant. Even if I didn't necessarily think the pacing was great, I did enjoy that. Things did come together in the end. There is a historical element to do with the climax of this book that I didn't necessarily love, and I can't talk about it without giving spoilers, but there is an ultimate conclusion to Tib and her friend's trickery. I won't say whether it was successful or not, I'm not going to give details, but it does involve a real life historical figure from the Tudor world, who, if you are at all knowledgeable about Tudor England in this time period, you will have heard of. And the second this person appeared in the narrative, I knew exactly where it was going. I knew exactly what this person's role in the story was going to be. And when it turned out to be true, I was pretty irritated. And it was one of those moments where I just had to take myself out of the book and be like, it's just the story, it's just the story, it's just the story. Rosanna Pike is not necessarily saying that this thing happened, but it is a Tudor historical fiction trope that does come up every now and then, and I really dislike, because there is no real evidence for this thing happening, but Rosanna Pike does lean on it. If anybody has read this book and they know what I'm talking about, please do come to my Instagram DMs and talk to me about it, because I want to know if it irritated anybody as much as it did me. At the same time, it's not enough to have completely ruined my enjoyment of this book. I'm just treating it as part of the fictional world, the fictional story that Rosanna Pike has created. Just on a historical perspective, it irked me a little bit. But otherwise, great book. And then in March, I read a book that just derailed everything, every plan that I had made for the month, but also brought me immense joy, and is currently my favourite book that I read so far this year. It is, of course, Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. Didn't expect that in 2025 my world would be upturned by the Hunger Games series yet again, but here we are. So this is the second prequel that Suzanne Collins has written for the Hunger Games trilogy. The first prequel was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which was looking at the ascension of the main villain of the story, Coriolanus Snow, and looking there at the 10th Hunger Games. In this book, we are looking at the 50th Hunger Games, the second quarter quell, in which we know from the original stories that the winner is going to be Haymitch Abernathy, who was the District 12 mentor for Katniss and Peeta in the original games. In the second book, Catching Fire, Peeta and Katniss end up watching Haymitch's games, and they do recap what happened. So, I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, were thinking, hang on, how is Suzanne Collins going to be able to create any sort of tension in a book where we basically know what happens? And we know what happens to Haymitch and his loved ones by the time that we get to the events of the Hunger Games. But my goodness, did she succeed? I really enjoyed the commentary in here on propaganda, on what we are shown to be true, and the actual events that happened. Because those of us who have read the Hunger Games series come to realise that what we knew about the Second Quarter Quell, yes, there were pockets of truth in there, but the whole story was actually very different to what the Capitol has depicted it to be. And I was amazed that Suzanne Collins was able to make the changes, the adjustments to the story that we thought we knew, which still made it feel like it fit in perfectly with everything that we knew, both about the character of Haymitch and other characters around him, and also the Capitol and how they do twist narratives. I really enjoyed following Haymitch as a protagonist, and it was just very tragic seeing maybe not an idealistic version of him, because I don't think he ever fully was, and certainly not as like forthright and dedicated to any particular cause as you would want him to be. But there is so much fire in him in this book that you just know by the events of the first Hunger Games book is just completely gone. And with this book you are just seeing brutality after brutality unfolding in front of Haymitch, whether it is directly to people that he loves or just those who are around him, and it is just devastating to read. There's a lot of discussion in here about implicit submission and the things that we just allow to happen. Moments where Haymitch is called out on the fact that he knows that something is wrong and yet he never does anything to challenge it. And you can completely understand from his perspective why he wouldn't do such a thing. But as a result of this, it means that their society as a whole ends up having to wait another 25 years for anything to change. But what's interesting about this is that people are questioning things, as you'd presume that they would be. That the roots of the rebellion against the Capitol were not just contained to the plot of Catching Fire and Mockingjay, but had much deeper roots. At first, when I was reading this, I thought all of the callbacks to various characters through the original story might be a little bit gimmicky, might be a little bit too much of fan service. But I thought that the majority of the characters who were brought back for this book were really cleverly utilised. It just added more to their characters than what we already knew from the original series. I had a fantastic time with this book, so I initially, physically eyeballs to page read this. I then went back up north and decided that I wasn't done with it, so I ended up buying the audiobook and having another listen to this. So I have technically read or listened to this twice. I then proceeded to go through the whole of the original trilogy, Hunger Games, Catching Fire and Mockingjay, all on audio just because I didn't have my copies with me. And yeah, it's the first time that I have listened or read this series since I was 16, 17. And yeah, 30-year-old Charlotte is finding that the Hunger Games series hits a little bit different when you're a fully grown adult and you've had a chance to see how governments act in the real world, and certain things are hitting home a little bit more than they used to. Goodness me, fantastic series. You know, not perfect by any means, but one that I definitely think holds up 15 years later. And then that is really all that she wrote when it comes to books that I finished in March 2025. I ended up DNFing one of my History-a-thon books, so I was reading a book called What She Ate, 6 Remarkable Women and the Food That Tells Their Stories, which is by Laura Shapiro. I was going to read this for the foodie prompt for History-a-thon. This is looking at 6 different women through history, those women being Dorothy Wordsworth, Rosa Lewis, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ava Brown, Barbara Pym and Helen Gurley Brown. What we know about the food that they ate, various sources that we have for uncovering that, and what it says about their wider society of the time. It's an interesting concept. I just found it was very dryly written. I found it a little bit boring. I feel like this maybe could have been a bit more engaging had each of the chapters been shorter and we just focused on more women, rather than what ended up happening, which was just vague biographies of their lives, which seemed to be a lot more geared towards talking about the important men in their lives than the women themselves, with smaller snippets about what they ate. I feel like this book would have just been a bit more impactful had it been a little bit more focused really on just the food and then talked about more women. I'm also partway through a buddy read of Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massie, and by buddy read I mean that myself, Gloria and Brittany were reading this. They were powering ahead. I went down a Sunrise on the Reaping rabbit hole, went home for my birthday, completely lost any track of reading, and then suddenly they were 60 chapters out from me and I was still on chapter 10. And I have been slowly but surely plodding my way through this ever since. When I talk to you now, it is currently the 8th of April and I am on chapter 44, page 266 of a book which is about 600 pages long. So in terms of buddy reading, I'm not doing too great, but you know, it's Catherine the Great. I am very glad to be reading this, even though I'm reading it at a much slower pace than my fellow buddy readers are. And I'm really sorry, I am being terrible. I'm just not a very good buddy reader. This is the issue with being a mood reader, is that the second that something becomes interesting to me, I'm like, oh, Let's go read that instead. And so Gloria and Brittany, I can only apologise for that. But I will read this. I will read this in April. Herstory-a-thon will continue, if only unofficially. So there we go. Those are the rest of the books that I ended up reading in March 2025. As I said in the last video, not really the most successful Herstory-a-thon that I've ever had, but I've still been really, really pleased to see other people taking part in this readathon. We will definitely be coming back for next year, and hopefully I can just be a little bit more disciplined. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken to you about today. Alternatively, please let me know whatever you read in March and really enjoyed. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.